to use new but also existing data to study the wealth distribution in South Africa. And yeah, to me, all this really makes Arup a pretty perfect fit for this summer school. So we're happy that he traveled here all the way from London to give a lecture on the wealth inequality in South Africa. Please welcome Arup.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Naiga, Dr. Capello, and Prof. Klein of course, Paul, for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here with you. It's my first time in Kampala, so thank you all for your very warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here and to learn from everyone. And I should just say at the start that this presentation is at the start of my research journey. So I don't have the 10 slides of publication that Prof. Klein put up at the back, and we're really just hopefully getting the momentum going. So perhaps I could just introduce this presentation. So I was asked to talk about wealth inequality in South Africa. And these set of slides have been put together with my colleague, Comfort Molefinyana. There's a section that I'll let you know is her sort of expertise around the gender question when it comes to wealth inequality. So, yeah, as Paul mentioned, I work in a center called the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And the motivation here really was that, I guess, when Piketty exploded with his inequality book, Capital, a lot of the discussions around inequality, even in the global south, were happening from that perspective. One of the things that we felt was really important is to show and to research inequality from the issues that were in of and for the global south. These are issues that have always been at the forefront and at the center of academic research in universities in the global south. But, you know, as Prof. Klein mentioned, a lot of the questions around inequality and the relations between countries and systems of accumulation after the neoclassical and neoliberal eras disappeared. And I think the one, great positive from Piketty's interjection is that suddenly questions of inequality were opened up again in the mainstream and in policy discourse as well. And that gave us an opportunity to think about some of these political economy questions that are so fundamental. So this sort of comes from our strategy, but we at the forefront we think that to understand inequality is an interdisciplinary exercise, and that's what we try to do in different bits of our research. These are the other programs that the center currently has. So perhaps some of these resonate with some of your research. We have a wide range. We're looking at climate change and inequality, which centers on questions of climate justice and climate resilience. Pre-distribution and ownership, that looks at the firm as a site of inequality and distribution. Black economic empowerment, which is specifically South African, but was one of the big initiatives in South Africa that, at least superficially, was meant to redress some of the historical injustices. But lots of research has come out on how that was. Hello? The mic's gone off. Maybe someone didn't like what I was saying. Yeah.
disabling all the channels.
the contestation of value between workers and the executives or the directors. Now you also have a very extractive layer of shareholders as well. So the concept of wealth, I think, is a fundamental lens. So this is perhaps just reiterating or reinforcing what Jacob was presenting. What Jakob was presenting right at the start. Wealth inequality typically is much more concentrated than income inequality. So in and of itself, it's an important dynamic to understand. But a lot of times when we talk about inequality, the wealthy is sort of is looked at, and then it's a conflation between incomes and wealth. So by separating wealth and income, I think you can really separate out those dynamics. Of course, they're interrelated, as I'll talk about later. But yeah, I think this is perhaps the same set of numbers that Jakob had up, but you can see both in the global north, but more so in the global south, wealth, the share of wealth that's captured by the top 10% is much higher than when you look at incomes. So again, income inequality then gives us only a partial understanding of overall economic inequality. But again, most of the work you'll see is around income inequality, and I'd say even more so because it looks around the labor market about wage inequality. But you know, as wealth increases and as incomes increases, it's actually income from wealth that becomes a more significant part of household income. And of course, it's when you get to the top 1%, capital incomes are just completely dominant. Since it's accumulated over time and passed on through generations, it captures all the previous factors from generations before, which can encompass discriminatory policies, historical policy choices around macroeconomic policies, systems of colonialism and exploitation, and that is captured in a wealth distribution. You could say it's captured in income distribution as well, but I'd say wealth captures that structural nature much more directly. And then again, as Howard explained at the beginning, the concentration of wealth leads to distortive economic power, but also other ways of power, political power, both indirect and direct. So the key features of household wealth then that make it interesting. The first is that it's transferable. So, you know, of course, you can pass it on, you can sell it and buy it, but just the fact that it's transferable is what makes it specific in its intergenerational nature. So you can't really pass on incomes, but you can pass on assets. Assets are really important for household welfare, whether we're talking about security in times of economic hardship, or we're talking about the ability to take risk to build up wealth in the future. For me, a key feature is ownership, because this is where you get control and you get exclusion. So the benefits of an asset are very specific, that it goes to the owner, and all the other stakeholders are excluded. And this is a key feature of the economy. I've already mentioned the historical nature, but we can think about these longer term type of analyses like accumulation processes and hysteresis and path dependence. And then with the wealth concentration, one of the things that we do in our project is we take this wealth concentration as an indicator of elite groups and elite power, which then opens up a set of new analytical tools that we can use to understand how these accumulation and exclusionary processes combine both sociologically and economically. So, yeah, so again, reinforcing perhaps what Howard was saying is that wealth allows us to bring in a plurality of explanatory factors and not just one sort of set of axioms that is prevalent in orthodox economics. So from wealth, you can look at these features. This is just an example. I think there's probably many more. And those in itself bring out a whole bunch of other ways of trying to understand wealth. So as an example, we also look at corporate governance. We've also looked at historical accumulation processes. And yeah, in our agenda, there's a lot more to do still. Even during the global pandemic, it was wealth that exploded and wealth inequality that exploded. And I think that really demonstrates the unique nature of wealth. So these are just some headlines from South Africa, Brazil, and India. Yeah, I think Jakob presented these similar statistics, but perhaps if I just skip this slide and I show this one, you can see when you break down the global wealth decile how it's distributed across countries, and you see that in the top decile, even in the top sort of 5%, North America and Europe dominate. In the middle deciles, you have this kind of the emerging economies of China and India and Asia Pacific, and in the bottom half deciles, a lot of African countries sit there. And on the left chart, you can see globally there's still a concentration of household wealth. So I'm briefly now just going to talk about the theories and models of accumulation. So I'm mentioning this, the neoclassical models as context. I think, hard-hitting Howard has already addressed a lot of this, but I just wanted to point to the life cycle hypothesis, which is the classic paradigm of understanding wealth inequality in households. So this is, pretty standard as when you're young and you go into the workforce, you haven't had much time to accumulate wealth or go up the income distribution. As you progress, you have more disposable income to save. And then when you retire, you start dissaving as you spend your pension money or whatever savings you have. So this is even within neoclassical analysis. This has not been empirically shown to be true. So actually, what you see is when you get to the peak of wealth, and this is even in global north countries, actually it's just a straight line across. So there's no dissaving happening. And that really empirically now starts to show the relevance of how wealth is held for intergenerational purposes. The models through which wealth inequality is assessed is usually through the imperfect credit markets, which affects investment in human capital, which then also has an impact on growth. This is, just a very limited understanding of the channels that can explain wealth inequality. So we don't really look at this. And then just to note as well, the econometric models, the macroeconometric models that try to reproduce the wealth distributions using the life cycle model have just not been able to create the huge gap in the wealth distribution just through this life cycle hypothesis. So they do rely on exogenous additions to wealth, i.e. inheritance or donations. So hopefully that backs up the skepticism around neoclassical analyses of wealth inequality. I'm not going to focus on this too much, but I think there's just a wide range of theories that come from heterodox and Marxian type of analysis that's useful to understand, useful to explain the wealth distribution that we see in the statistics. I think perhaps everyone's familiar with these ones, but perhaps I'll just focus a little bit on the social structures of accumulation, which allows us to add these social and institutional characteristics or the arrangements that have taken place over time, and how that contributes to creating these distributionary consequences. Various people have used this, loosely used this approach. I think in South Africa, the most famous one is from Prof. Ben Fine, looking at the mineral energy complex and how the mining and energy industries and even the manufacturing industries were supported by the legal arrangements of the government to create the economic model during colonial and apartheid South Africa. I think everyone's discussed quite in depth the land question. This is not my area of expertise at all, but of course it plays a huge role. And corporate governance as well, I think, is becoming an important part of the question. In our multidisciplinary research, we have at this moment used this elite's definition, those who have vastly proportionate control over or access to a resource, to use elites and wealth inequality to provide that multidisciplinary lens. And more broadly, these are some of the ways of approaching the wealth inequality question through the elite lens. So a large part of the sociological work looks at elite perceptions, the justification being that because of elite power, they are often the ones who shape or who influence the ability of government to take redistributive policy measures. There are social spaces of elites, such as networking areas, schools, business schools, etc., that kind of reproduce those exclusionary spaces to ensure that the wealth-making opportunities can stay within a certain network. And that's often prevalent in countries in the global south as well. For example, a colleague of mine in India looks at the spaces of caste, of the upper castes, and how these social boundaries reinforce accumulation. Elite strategies of wealth management, which mostly looks at, I suppose, tax evasion and tax avoidance. And then elite foundations of democracy, which I think is perhaps a bit contestable in terms of the theoretical framework, but it sort of takes this broad macro perspective to say that the elite contestation at the time of transition and how the balance of power is determines the nature of the state during democracy. And so where the incumbent elite have a huge amount of power, there's usually some arrangement that limits the distribution or the redistribution of wealth and income, but also other limits also other redistribution of land and sort of other policies that might be more egalitarian. So my next set of slides is about the definition and the measurement. But I won't spend too long on this because actually Jakob spoke to this on the first day. But it does underpin a lot of the work that we've done in South Africa. So I just wanted to revisit it quite briefly. The definition of wealth is quite specific. So the net asset is assets minus liabilities. And it's the value of all the assets that are owned by a household less the value of debt at a particular point in time. But I think the definition of asset is quite useful because it's this valuation that can become either speculative or it can inform a lot of the motivation behind the accumulation of assets. So it's a store of value representing a benefit or a series of benefits accruing to the economic owner over a period of time. And when we're talking about benefit or a series of benefits, we're also talking about future expected benefits, and that's where the speculation comes in. And this is what's behind a lot of the transformations that have happened in the economy, such as the financialization of land. Another key concept for household wealth is that wealth is the stock, whereas incomes are the flow. And I'd still say that a lot of the research is focused on the flows, but because the stocks have built up over time, there is not these have huge structural consequences, and our hope in the project is to shine a much brighter light on this issue of stocks. So when it comes to categorizing assets, these are the sort of high-level categories of non-financial and financial assets, and then we go to the liabilities, which is usually around long-term debt and short-term debt. At the household level, long-term debt is usually tied to your property or to the house. I think what's interesting is when you compare countries, there's often a different balance between financial and non-financial. And as I'll show later, South Africa has a huge prevalence towards financial forms of wealth. This is just a reference. I'm not, I know the writing's small, but this is a very categorical list of assets. So just to give a reference, this comes from the OECD Framework for Statistics. And there are ways of adjusting this to make it more context specific, but it's worth a look if you want to take the lens of wealth. So I think this is just one way of illustrating what those dynamics between income and wealth inequality are. When you compare person A and person B, who is better off? And often when people just look at those with high income or high salaries, there's a dynamic that's missing, because if, say, that person loses their job, then suddenly they fall down the distribution. Whereas that is unlikely to happen with someone that sits on top of a wealth distribution. And I think this is really important in a lot of the dynamics in the global south, where you have a new wave of people that are just emerging into the middle class, but they still have obligations, financial obligations to different, say, members of their family, and they carry a huge burden. We see this in South Africa, first generation that are in these salaried jobs, but a lot of those costs dissipate away quite quickly. So on the income distribution, they might be quite high, but when you take into account all the expenses that they face, they're often worse off than counterparts that are much wealthier. So this informs the South African study that I'm going to talk about later. But the data sources that can be used to contribute to understanding of wealth are broadly these kind of three areas. So you have the macro statistics, which are usually produced by central banks, which record the aggregate wealth from different sources. Then you have the surveys, which, I think everyone's familiar with anyway. But those need not only capture questions on wealth, but because of some of the techniques that have been developed, the questions of incomes are very useful to also calculate wealth. And then a new source of data that is not universal, but it has been in South Africa, is the tax data that comes from the revenue authorities. So generally, tax data is better than surveys at capturing the top end of the distribution, and there's they're still underreporting, but it provides a method to triangulate the data. Let me just skip past this, unless we can talk about this later if needed. So so Jakob talked about some of these methods for estimation, but perhaps I'd just like to quickly talk about the capitalization method, because this is one that we used. So this is where you can use incomes, and you can have a sort of average return if you know the interest rate, or you know the average return on stocks, and you can just do a reverse calculation to calculate or estimate the stock from which the incomes flow. And this is really useful because then it allows us to use existing household surveys to also estimate the wealth distribution. The estate multiplier method is not that easily doable because the tax is based on tax records, and those are often quite difficult to access. So South Africa is pretty lucky in that there is a real depth of data that can be used to calculate this. So this is the national statistics, the quarterly bulletin that gives those aggregate figures. Then we have quite a few surveys. The National Income Dynamics Surveys is a panel study that does have questions on wealth. You have household surveys that capture a lot of questions on different types of incomes, and then the census, which gives an idea of the demography. And then finally, we had a period where we had access to tax data, around 10 years, and I'm not sure. So I think there's been a few more years. There was a pause during the pandemic years, and then it's been updated. But we use a combination, but the pay-as-you-earn is the income tax that you pay, and that is usually reported and even paid by companies, so it's quite an accurate data source. And that's used to capture the top end of the distribution, because it captures things like capital incomes, and so interest income, which is reported by banks, and dividend incomes, which is reported by the financial companies. Okay, so now this is what I'm supposed to be talking about a bit, and just to give you a break from my voice, hopefully, I'll just play this introduction video about South Africa for anyone that's not familiar with it. Let's see if it opens up.
This is Alexandra, a low-income township situated in Johannesburg, South Africa. And this is Sandton. This is Alexandra, a low-income township situated in Johannesburg, South Africa. And this is Sandton, an affluent suburb in Johannesburg, South Africa. In Sandton, people drive luxury vehicles, shop in malls, and live in multi-million rand homes, while in Alexandra, people walk or use public transport, shop in small street corner shops, and share rooms in shacks with little to no reliable basic services. It's clear that these two places are worlds apart. Although they're not, Alexandra is located just 3 kilometers from Sandton. This is not a unique situation in these regions. Similar situations can be seen in countries across the global south. This is Alexandra, a low-income township situated in Johannesburg, South Africa. And this
day marks.
So that video was okay, so yeah, I was obviously overambitious with my attempt to bring in multimedia. So I think sort of that picture of Johannesburg is perhaps quite a common feature of many countries in the global south. You see similar images in in many other countries. So our approach to understanding wealth inequality is to start at the distribution and then work towards the explanations, perhaps rather than the other way around, which is to start at the historical accumulation processes and work towards the distribution. So using those data sources that I shared, there's a comparison here. We did an estimate of the distribution, and you can see that the top 1% and top 10% shares are higher than many other countries. Surprisingly, also higher than Russia, which is quite well known for its its oligarchy, and the bottom 50% share is also lower than many countries. I'll show the specific numbers in the next table. But you can already see from there that it's the bottom 50% share is negative or very close to zero. Of course, there's there's potential for estimation errors, specifically as data around debt is quite difficult. But we did do some tests to corroborate it, and we think it's broadly tells the picture. So these are the numbers. So as you can see, the top 3,500 people own as much as 32 million people in South Africa. The top decile owns 85% of all wealth, which I think passes Jacob's test of whether it's a credible estimate. And the bottom 50% are on average in net debt. And sorry, that should read have no wealth to speak of. We did these estimates right on the cusp of when the COVID pandemic hit. And I think these numbers had huge resonance because it showed that there was no way that households could survive their already extremely vulnerable and precarious situation. And then with with all movement stopped, that just, I think that created a lot of desperation. And after many years of really hard fighting by civil society and activists, there was a grant that was put forward far too late. But I think these numbers demonstrate the precarity and vulnerability of of a large portion. I mean, half of the portion of South Africa, And that's just to say, that's not to say low wealth. This is zero or negative wealth, i.e. in debt. And then, you can see how quickly you go through the thresholds to get to the top 10%, top 1%, and then eventually to the top 0.1%. And you're talking about just huge scales. And these, there's huge scales in income, but this is way above the multiples that you get in the income distribution. Another thing to note is that in a lot of analysis you see that by distribution you see that in the bottom percentiles there's a lot of, say, cash that's part of the wealth holdings, and in the top of the distribution there's a lot of stocks and bonds and financial type of products, and that paints one picture, but this paints a very different picture. This shows that the wealthy dominate all classes of assets. So we're talking about deposits, businesses, housing, bonds and stock. When you look at bonds and stock, they top 10% own pretty much all of it. And where most economic growth happens through companies that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, this is a major route of distribution for those profits that are where directly owned bonds and stocks provide that route, and that is dominated by the wealthy. Indirectly, it's less concentrated when it's come to pensions, and that reflects a specific arrangement in South Africa, which is the public sector pension fund, which covers pensions for nurses, teachers, and civil servants and other public sector workers. But that's something to be investigated about how that creates this contradictory forces when it comes to wealth. I think this chart has also been quite striking. So net asset or wealth inequality has not declined from 94, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of South Africa. But 94, more or less, is the period when South Africa started to become its democratic transition, and at least on the surface, the ANC had a huge mandate to address poverty, which by the rhetoric, it would have lowered inequality, but you can see that the top 1% over a longer period have remained the core owners of the economy. And then what I was mentioning before, you can see that over time, wealth has been held more financially through financial assets. South Africa played a specific role in colonial Southern Africa. It was a center for the imperial circuit of finance because of the mining. So actually, the stock exchange has been around for since the mid 1800s, and so in many respects, South Africa has always been financialized. But when it comes to the personal ownership of assets, the ownership has become more financialized over time. And then finally, these are estimates according to age cohorts. So we don't have data to look at inheritance directly, but this is a strong indicator of the importance of intergenerational wealth, because you see that even amongst the younger age groups, the younger cohorts, if you remember the life cycle hypothesis, this should be the period when pretty much everyone is equal, according to the neoclassical hypothesis. You still have a high concentration of wealth, a high inequality of wealth, and that implies the heavy presence of intergenerational wealth. So sorry, 1 second. So now that that sort of snapshot of the wealth distribution, now we have that picture. We are then now in our project trying to explain it both temporally and in terms of contemporary political economy. So temporally is more about the historical accumulation processes. And in one of the working papers that we've done, we've used approximate timelines. These years aren't exact because policies are across these periods. But we start with the colonial pre-apartheid era, which was dominated by the mining needs of the British Empire. But there was also a lot of contestation between the original colonial settlers, the Afrikaners, who were originally based in agriculture, but then started to develop industrial policy that could support Afrikaner empowerment. This got turbocharged during apartheid, which was, I think everyone knows, was just this hugely segregationist and exploitative era. But I think in terms of economic regimes, we've characterized it here as a semi-developmental state. Semi because it only benefited the white population, but there were features that could be described as the Keynesian economic paradigm that was common in other developmental states. And then the third period, which is the democratic era, which consistent with the global trends that included neoliberal and financialization as the dominant economic paradigm. I think there's perhaps too much writing on this slide, but just the main point here that I wanted to show is that even prior to the periods that I mentioned just now, wealth inequality dynamics were fundamental to the evolution of colonialism. So to give a very brief example, the first colonial settlers, wealth inequality emerged because there were monopolies over the supply of goods and services to the Cape Colony, which was initially the Dutch settlement. Then, because there was huge wealth inequality, the Dutch settlers moved outwards, and this was part of the land enclosures and restrictions on access to land and water. So this was part of the expansionary settler colonialism. So wealth gives this really important understanding as a lens to also these historical analyses of settler colonialism in South Africa. Of course, fundamental to settler colonialism in these periods was the slave society, originally brought in by the Dutch, where they brought in laws and institutions from their East Indies colonies. But also this was the start of the land enclosures and the land grants that were given to settlers at the expense of the indigenous populations. And this is the first introduction of the private landholding and property rights system in South Africa. Of this specific nature, I should say. And then a key part here is that during this third period here, 1820 to 1910, there was the discovery of diamonds and gold, which just transformed the nature of the economy in South Africa, and it accelerated land dispossessions, and the you had the initiation of the creation of reserves to create cheap labor for the mines. And you also had this circulatory migration of labor that would allow the mines to keep their labor costs low. So in this first era that we focus on, we do look at 1910 to 1948, which was what we're labeling as the colonial pre-apartheid era. And we've looked at sort of different elements: the economic, the legal, the social, and in the economic arena, we can see that the agricultural sector was heavily subsidized, and that was to keep the Afrikaner elites and the Afrikaner population to keep their support. A lot of the surpluses from the mines were used to provide these subsidies, as well as building infrastructure such as rail transport. There was also support for growth in infant manufacturing, and financial services also developed quite extensively. But to go to the land question, this was the introduction of a huge array of legislation. So, for instance, you had the Natives Land Act, which made it illegal for Africans to acquire or rent any land outside existing reserves. And so Africans constituted 2/3 of the population, but it meant that this dispossession reduced the land reserved to them to only 7.3% of the total. These dynamics have to be considered crucial in understanding the wealth distribution to this day. Then let me skip to the labor, some of the labor acts. The Native Labor Regulation Act of 1911. This put a breach on the contract for African laborers employed on the mines. So all African miners were recruited on a temporary basis, never a permanent contract, unlike the white workers. And the usual contract was for 12 to 18 months. And they were prohibited from seeking or taking up any other jobs. While they were on the mines, they were housed and fed in large sort of single-sex compounds, which really broke many of the social structures. And then at the end of the contracted period, they were required to go back to the area from which they had come, which was this ever-shrinking reserves, where they would be able to live out their sort of retirement age. So this was really important. A lot of Marxist economists viewed this as fundamental to the capitalist system in Southern Africa. So whereas a lot of the discussion had been around how capitalism transforms all of society, this analysis showed something different, that capitalism required this coexistence of these different societies. It helped keep the wages low because the mines did not have to pay, as an example, the retirement funds or the social care funds or generally the costs required for social reproduction. There were other acts, the Mine and Works Act, which provided job reservations for white people. And then finally, another example is a union government in 1910, which arranged the economic needs of the mining elite and promoted the needs of English and Afrikaner workers. So this is all just to give an example of the very start of these inequality creating processes that have been crucial and have compounded over time. I think also what's interesting to know at this time is the creation of Sanlam, which is a financial institution. It could be considered the first asset managers in South Africa. And so they were crucial to redistributing a lot of the gains from the mine to the Afrikaner population. So I'm just going to quickly skip through some of the slides in the interest of time. So just to give an example of some of the organizations and the actors, the reason I've put this here is because when I go to the last slide in the historical explanation, you'll actually be able to trace through all of these names. So Anglo-American were fundamental to the diamond and the diamond and the gold mining, and then and in later periods different mining. Barclays was part of the colonial finance circuit, Standard Bank, Anglophile, and the actors. Oppenheimer was the one who founded Anglo-American, and then on the other side, and this is some of the discussion around elite contestation, the Afrikaner elite was through a large organization that could be said to represent their interest, was the company I mentioned, Sanlam. Then during the apartheid era, there was a turbocharge of these hugely exploitative frameworks. So with in the economic arena, there was huge support and tariff protection for manufacturing. A lot of this manufacturing was related to the mining industry, but not only. So the motor vehicle industry expanded, steel and iron production, and then coal and platinum. But there was also huge resettlement policies that perhaps a lot of people know about already. So I won't go into this, but this included the Group Areas Act, which continued to resettle people into these reserves. African people into these reserves that were called the Bantustans, and this was both political and economic. So this slide just shows the continuation of key actors, and the reason why, again, I'm highlighting actors is because when you look now at the rich list, you see Oppenheimer and the family at the very top. And now Anton Rupert, who with support from the Afrikaner sort of state and Sanlam, set up his empire. You see his son's family, I think, at the top of the rich list as well. So again, this really just highlights the historical roots of the wealth distribution. And then finally, the democratic era. Politically, there was, of course, the reversal of a lot of the discriminatory laws. However, economically, it was not as transformative as many of the people had hoped. So I think Howard talked a lot about the macro policies that were adopted because of the World Bank and the IMF, the structural adjustment policies. South Africa imposed it on itself. And the government at the time said this was to prevent the interference of the IMF and the World Bank, but essentially it achieved the same thing. The amount of expenditure that would have been needed to really support a transformative economy, that was not funded at all. And then with mining, which on the face of it was seen as having a transformative potential through these policies of economic empowerment, black economic empowerment, actually what you saw was a lot of unbundling, dual listing, a lot of capital flows that disappeared out of South Africa. And it really, one of the motivations was if it was dual listed, those mining assets would be protected by regulations, as an example, on the London Stock Exchange, which would prevent the South African government from seizing a lot of those assets, which is what the incumbent elite were afraid of. And so then this, again, gives the list that I was talking about. You have Johann Rupert, who was part of Rembrandt that you saw in the earlier slide. Oppenheimer, who is part of the first and second time periods, and some new entrants as well. That we can discuss if it's of interest. So again, to look at some of these historical roots, the picture on the right is what you saw in the video. Nothing too much has changed from the apartheid city that was designed, or that was a common layout during the apartheid era. And perhaps you can't see a lot of the detail, but essentially on the inside, where you had most of the jobs that were reserved for white people, you had this buffer zone on the outside, and then you'd have the townships on the outside, which would be where a small number of black workers could reside. That would act as the service workers for the town, and then far away you had the reserves that would provide the temporary migratory labour. And this is contemporary Johannesburg, Alexandria, and Sandton, and this still, it has the same model. There are lots of interesting dynamics to explore just within urban planning. You see a lot of people who have moved into sort of, like a new middle class that have moved into these what's called the northern suburbs. But there hasn't really been too much change. A lot of transformative urban policies have been blocked by those that are looking to protect their asset values. So again, I think this really highlights the importance about thinking about some of these issues in terms of wealth. So just examples of buffer elements that persist include large tracts of public open space that are vacant, but that aren't being used either for housing or for development. These are often sort of protected and guarded by private security. There's the way the industry is laid out is still through industrial belts and border industries. There's a huge inequality in municipal services, and there's similar issues around land use. So I think I'm almost done. I'm going to skip through a few slides. I think there are other key topics that we are looking to explore. I think wealth inequality and gender is a big one, the gender asset gap. One of the really important studies has been one that was conducted in Kenya, India, and I think Brazil. No, I'm completely wrong here. Ecuador, Ghana, and India. And that's something that I think remains to be done in a lot of countries, and that can help understand some of the institutional factors around gendered inequality. There's also, if you look at the top of the distribution, gender in the elite, I think there are a lot of interesting dynamics to be studied there. A lot of that work has happened with Indian sociologists that are looking at caste and gender. And I think that remains a key area of research. These pie charts here are just a very quick representation of the project that came from the paper by Doss et al. And you see that in Ecuador there's quite an equal share of wealth. In India, it's dominantly male ownership, and in Ghana still dominantly male ownership, but less so. And critical are some of the norms and laws that are governing property ownership. So this is specifically around who gets listed in the property rights. I will skip through this, but I'll share the slide so you can have a look later on. In South Africa, this has just been done using a survey that already exists, and again, this shows the importance of real estate in the division of the gender wealth gap. But you can see when it comes to business assets, it's much more skewed towards male-owned wealth, and the same with vehicles. So those are also interesting dynamics that need to be explored more. The racial wealth divide, a lot of this work has happened in America. And there's one study that we haven't listed here as well that looks at the long-term determinants and the evolution of the racial wealth gap. That shows in America that such was the devastating impact of slavery and the lack of restitutive justice, that even with any other policies that could address wealth inequality, it would still lead to this huge racial wealth gap. This is perhaps more key in South Africa than other countries, but there are still other categories through which these wealth gaps could be analyzed to provide real insight. In South Africa, the racial wealth gap, we've just again calculated through that NIDS survey, and we see that the white-black gap ratio in South Africa was 8-1 in 2019. So this is a huge wealth gap that persists and demonstrates that the policies haven't been sufficient to be transformative. And this is a final slide that I think indicates why more work is needed to think about wealth inequality and how to address it. These are really the only suggestions that come out when you do a quick look at policies to address wealth inequality. And as has been discussed by several people, you need to look at these broader macro policies, public investment, infant industry development, and so on to really have a huge push to reduce wealth inequality. We did a paper on the potential for a wealth tax in South Africa, which we think is fairly viable because there's a very developed financial and tax system, and a lot of this revenue could be used to support some of these expenditures. The worker-led companies and the cooperative financing is something that is always suggested as a countervailing kind of way of organizing. I think a lot more research needs to happen there. Baby bonds is something that comes out of the US. So when a baby is born, the state allocates a bond to that individual, and that can be accessed when the child turns 18. And when you look at educational inequalities, finance is one of those big inequities that lead to different outcomes. And it's difficult to imagine that having a huge impact in countries in the global south. So I think a really important part of the next step of the research is to start thinking about the broader policy environment through which wealth inequality can be reduced. And I think, that's it for me.
Does it work? Yeah, perfect. All right, Arup, thank you very much for this insightful lecture, which I'm sure contained many parallels also to the countries and contexts that people in this room are studying. We'll now have questions. again, let's try to do 3 at a time, and also I would ask you to really focus on the question that you have, so Arup can remember his answers. Can somebody go around with the... Yeah, let's start here and then...
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. I have 2 questions, briefly. One, you mentioned that in South Africa, 0.01% own close to 90% of the financial assets, if I got you right. Now, my concern is, and as a question, that are there any deliberate redistribution policies by government intended to reconcile those patterns that are actually imbalanced? And what's the impact, if any? Then the other question about mining the minerals in South Africa. You grew up learning much of minerals being mined in South Africa. What is your experience on the mining industry? How is it performing in terms of the policy framework vis-a-vis the sustainability of these resources? Those are my 2 questions. Thank you so much.
All right, moving over here.
Thank you, Arup, for this very interesting presentation. My first concern about South Africa is that the system, I think, originally has been rigged in such a way that the wealth and inequality may never actually be solved. My interest is, in the last slide, you talked about the tax and the baby boons and so many other things. What anecdotal evidence do you have since you live in South Africa? Because if you look at the case of Sandton and then the Alex series, that is really happening, or that you see is improving the widening gaps in inequality. Because now, if you look at your earlier slides, you talked about black empowerment. What is it that these guys, if you remember, the recent, the fallout in ANC as the government, and that has been in power for so many years now, after apartheid. You see that looks like the black elites are simply continuing with the same old story. So I'm interested in what you know, the anecdotal evidence in really what's happening. Thank you.
Frank is my name, and thanks for the presentation. If you are here and you are not provoked, then I think there is a problem. This presentation provokes many minds, especially on the 0.01% owning 90% of the wealth in that country called South Africa. Now, before they answer a question whether there is a redistribution of policies, let me just go to another question. What could be the factors hindering or constraining South Africans from raising against this inequality? Is there factors that, why is that they seem to be comfortable with this inequality? What could be the factors that could be constraining their motivation to raise against this existing inequality? Number two, I can see your presentation, you're coming from Inequality Center in South Africa. I'm sure you have done a lot of studies on this particular topic. So my question is, looking at the pre-apartheid and the post-apartheid period, I can see there is nothing that has changed. They are the same. And you have done studies. Now, research studies, yes, you have done it. Thank you.
Over to you,
But
Arup.
what is missing in terms of implementing those recommendations at the center? Thank you.
All right, now to you.
So thank you everyone for your questions. And I think just broadly to highlight is the reason why I think the wealth inequality picture is so important to put out there is that it shows these structural inequalities and it shows that very little has changed. And so it counters some of the narratives that are out there that, you know, using certain policies has provided some social mobility and some improvement. So broadly speaking, I'm in agreement with the sentiment that has been shared. So to specific questions around some of the redistributive policies around financial assets, the main policy, and I'm going to call it in inverted commas policy, has been this private sector initiative that's been adopted by the public sector in later waves called Black Economic Empowerment. And this was meant to be, in its first wave, was meant to be a redistribution of the ownership of key sectors of the economy to a new black elite, which also speaks to a bit of the second question. Now, this was a private sector initiative. So this was an initiative by the incumbent apartheid era elite on how they could continue in this new democratic era when the writing was on the wall that politically they would not have any influence directly. Many studies have shown that the way that these changes in ownership have happened have not resulted in a wider benefit or a benefit for the wider population. The first wave actually tried to include ownership that included maybe some union ownership and some other bits, but the way these transfers were financed were either debt financing or finance that was supported by the sellers themselves, and various other complicated mechanisms. So a lot of those returns that were supposedly received, a lot of those went out to repay the interest payments. So the benefits to the new owners were questionable to begin with. But then when the first Asian crisis happened and the commodity prices plunged, a lot of these consortiums actually just went under. And because those shares were then transferable, they ended up getting bought up by the parent company anyway. Then later waves tried to incorporate these broader elements, so it became a broad-based black economic empowerment, and this is when the government got involved a bit more, and this was to try target the leadership of some of the companies, and so there was some broader targets around employment equity and training and education. But perhaps when you look at the stock exchange, you do see more inclusion of this new black elite, but the ownership is still, the ownership and control and the direction of the economic sector is still fairly small. For various reasons, a lot of the partners that were found in this redistribution were the politically connected ones, which was a narrow segment of the power, the new power elite, and a lot of their role was actually just ended up being quite uninvolved. So it was either because of their political connections, just to smooth the transfers through, or for other sort of mediation strategies to go and find different members that could smooth the transition across. But there was very little actual influence within the directorship and within the control of these companies, and especially within finance, about directing finance perhaps towards infant industries. And as a result, a lot of the impulse was to keep the domination of the existing industries. And of course, I think everyone knows that for sort of solutions that can create more employment, you need to develop a secondary industry, perhaps manufacturing, and that, because of the gear plan that I mentioned, that strategy was completely abandoned, and so those opportunities to create this wider empowerment was lost. And then just to note as well that a lot of the mining companies, they unbundled. So they separated a lot of their mining assets, and the mining assets that they viewed as unprofitable would be the ones that they offered up for this trade or this transfer. So it was black economic empowerment in name only, and those that did benefit were this narrow elite of politically connected, the new black elite, which I think speaks to the third question. I would say that there has been a reaction now, because for the first time, ANC has lost its majority. And you could say, it's come too late or it's not enough, but it has been a seismic political move in the context of South Africa, especially when you read ANC statements. Their own vision, perhaps overconfident vision, was that they would be the ones to steward South Africa for centuries. And so this has really been a seismic shift in the South African landscape. But will that change the structures? I think that's very difficult to understand at the moment. And I would suggest that without these wider policies, those structures won't really change. My last slide about the policy suggestions, I think it was more to highlight that there's not enough work that's been done to understand the broader institutional and economic policies that are required to really transform the wealth inequality scenario. Baby bonds hasn't been tested in South Africa. This was just a quick look at what policies do exist. I think the tests in the US have shown quite positive results, but that's a completely different problem and a different sort of political economy. I don't think it has a redistributionary effect in South Africa. We're talking about, you've got broad unemployment of 45%. So that's almost half the population aren't in the labor market at all. So I think we're looking at a huge structural issue in South Africa that needs much larger policy ambitions. And then the mining and minerals policy framework and whether it's sustainable. I have to say this is not my expert area, so I'm not really able to give an informed answer on this. But there have been attempts to create these policy frameworks that regulate how mining is done and how the labor negotiations are done and how ownership is construed within the mining policy sector. That's on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also have areas where mining is expanding through expropriation of land, and especially of communal land. And this is where a lot of civil society activists sit to try and resist that. So there are these contradictory forces within mining where it's seen as a way of sharing the growth driver in South Africa, but at the same time, it's also been it also remains quite a exploitative and appropriating sector in South Africa. So I think there's a huge challenge there. I think I've answered all the questions, but if not, yeah, I'm happy to chat afterwards.
All right. Do we have time for more questions? Maybe, yeah, I see some hands. Where's the second? Perfect.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And having shared and having looked at so many things that you've talked about on the stuff of wealth and inequality and policies and so forth, and based on your experience in your studies, what affirmative action would you propose towards this animal called wealth inequality that is really workable for the South African population and which can also be replicated in the rest of Africa? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It is quite inspiring, but also motivating in one or the other. And actually, as you were discussing with us about wealth inequality in South Africa, in myself, I was seeing the levels of imbalances in resources between the blacks and then the whites, who were the owners of factories, industries, and all the other places that were ideally a source of revenue or income for the people in South Africa. And that one means that people were unable, especially the blacks, to access quality socio-economic services, maybe to improve on their wealth. Now, when you look at that scenario, and from what you have shared with us, definitely where there is wealth inequality, you expect to have gender inequality as well. And even when you were explaining to us, you talked about the gender inequality. And I know most of the people that were working in those factories, ideally, they might have been women. Does this research that you conducted has a bearing that maybe the government and the other private sectors could buy a leaf from your findings to inform next intervention? Because like you even said, like from the presentation, there is no much impact for all that period of time amidst the different interventions. Do you think there is any bearing that could inform the government and the private sector for an action to improve on the status quo of the people in South Africa? And then two, from your observation and from what is happening, is there any lens that has never been touched or was ignored during your survey that when you revisit your findings, you may think maybe this could have been the best way to address these challenges that have never been addressed at this moment? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. You highlighted gender inequality, gender-based wealth inequality. You talked about South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana. Do you have some statistics from the European countries for the sake of comparison purposes? Thank you.
All right. I think these were three, so we hand it over to Europe.
Okay. Just the quickest first with the gender gap. So we specifically haven't done the study yet. These were some other researchers that have looked at it initially, and I think that's what we're hoping to do in a next round of research. But yeah, I don't have any European statistics, but I can look for some and share it with you. Yeah, absolutely. It'd be really interesting to understand those dynamics. And then, I think a few questions have been around the solutions, and this is really the million-dollar question. And disappointingly, I don't have any specific interventions that I can point to that would have this impact on wealth inequality. But I will just refer to a few things that always come up in these sort of discussions. So the first point is that when revisiting the policy choices, the key, I think, as with many countries, the key policy choices that were made in the mid-90s were around liberalization and macroeconomic structural adjustment, and that really set the course for accumulation at the top end rather than broad-based. So that time has passed and those structures have compounded. So it would be, for a next wave of researchers, I think it would be really important to understand how we can bring about those sort of wider benefiting policies that could develop a nation's economy for wider redistribution. So I think that's the first point. But also at that transition point in South Africa, certain choices were made about how the economy was going to develop, and the choice that was made, which is actually quite similar to the choices that were made in the UK and the US, was that it would be a services-based industry. But what was unwritten in that is that there's a huge skills bias in the services-based industry, and the reason why this is the case is that the services that then get provided sit around the financial services, which already benefits the wealthy, because the wealthy are the ones who have the access to the education and the training to get those very high-paying jobs. And in South Africa, there's a huge skills premium that means the accumulated incomes that just add on to the wealth inequality have just repeated this dynamic. So that's perhaps the second moment of intervention that took a wrong direction. One of the initiatives that have come from some of the research that my colleagues have done at the centre has been to this is yet to happen, but to publicise the wage differentials between the executives and the workers in many of the listed companies, and it's hoped that transparency can change some of the decisions made around executive remuneration. But that's in action, and I don't think that's necessarily applicable everywhere. It remains to be seen if it works anyway in South Africa. And then I think a final point is to go back to why thinking about assets is really important conceptually, because as an example, so what I was relating to before is that is a site of contestation between value, overvalue. And if you look at, for example, the sector of property is an asset, and you now see a lot of these dynamics that when it comes to property development, it's removed from urban planning, and often many of these areas develop their own autonomous governance systems that de-link from government. There are a lot of elite pressures that are put onto adjusting policies in favor of wealth accumulation. And then finally, for those broader development structures, I think it's also been mentioned in other presentations, institutional investors and asset managers become huge role players in determining what sort of properties, what the strategy for property development is. And it takes away from the prime purpose and the ability of the state for a social provisioning of housing. And that has moved this sort of issue away from urban planners and local government and even national government. So this financialization of housing then becomes a site of contestation, and there are examples, for instance, in Brazil, where some of our researchers have also worked, where civil society have resisted plans by these sort of huge property developers that are linked into the institutional finance. They've resisted a lot of these huge developments that are happening. One of my colleagues in South Africa is investigating at the moment these elite processes of city making, so of creating these elite enclaves that, on the one hand, act as a way of preserving wealth, but also act as a way of insulating the wealthy from connections to the rest of society. So I think there are all these areas that we can bring to the table now with policymakers, now that inequality is a central part of the discussion, and perhaps to reconstitute some of these relationships is really important. I can't say sitting here that I know exactly the mechanism through which that can happen, but I think looking at these areas that are wealth inequality enhancing, especially in areas of social provisioning, so public services, social services, housing, healthcare, etc., are key areas of urgent intervention. Yeah, so I think perhaps that covers most of it. But again, if I've missed anything, please give me a shout.
All right. Since we're running a bit late, we've overdrawn a bit, I would give the final question to the lady there, who already has the microphone, and then afterwards... Oh, you don't have the microphone yet. So it's the final question. Anybody else, as Arup said, just approach him in the break. He will be happy to answer your questions. So after this one and the answer, we'll have tea.
Thank you for this great presentation. When we talk about democracy, we are looking at the government. I think the simplest definition for the people by the people. So I'm wondering, apart from gaining the political power, what democratic rights did the people of South Africa achieve after the apartheid? And how were there changes that were made in terms of policies, so that now, even as you do this study, you've been in position to evaluate as to whether some of the changes were, in terms of economic policies, have been effective or not? Because when you are looking at, for example, you are proposing policy reforms, you have mentioned wealth tax. I believe it is the very people who still have the wealth. Was there anything to do with the change in terms of ownership of property or how to tax? Because when I look at the situation in our country here, it is mostly the wealthy are the ones who are making policies. So when you talk about tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax holidays, it is the wealth that attain all those. And most times when URA, Uganda Revenue Authority, comes in, we have had scenarios of where people have been even found not paying taxes, and they still go free. Even some of the impounded goods are released. So I'm wondering how it is working there. Maybe another question that I found, one of your recommendations was on baby bonds, and what you recommended having children born having public fund accounts. I don't know how it works here. In here, I think many people would give birth, including those who have finished. So I'm wondering how practically this would be used to distribute wealth, or you'd have many more challenges.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think with the baby bonds, again, I was not suggesting it as a policy for here or for countries in the global south. It was to illustrate that there's more thinking that needs to be done genuinely about solutions to wealth inequality. So the baby bonds comes out of policy suggestions in America. And, I think the key point for our center is to look at solutions that make sense in the South African or in the global south context. So yes, my recommendation is not necessarily to think of, to promote baby bonds. But more that more research needs to be done on how to address wealth inequality. The tax system in South Africa is relatively quite well developed. So this is one of the reasons why we think wealth tax is viable in South Africa, where it may not be in other countries. And a large part of this is because a large part of wealth is held by few people. So it means you don't have to administer to a large, the whole population like you would with income taxes or with consumer taxes. The second part is that a lot of wealth is held in finance, and these forms of wealth are captured by third party, meaning by banks who are legally obligated to report it, or other financial intermediaries. But of course, the wealthy employ 20 floors of lawyers and accountants just to avoid tax. Whereas, I know from my experience in government, it's maybe one floor. So there's always going to be evasion and avoidance, and I think it's these international initiatives that are now taking place are really important to try at least coordinate the fight against tax evasion. But this is part and parcel of the current financialized system. So using tax havens is exactly how capitalism operates. It's a key feature of it. You raise a central question that many people continue to ask, is that has the political enfranchisement after apartheid, has it meant anything without kind of this economic redress? And to many, it's quite evident that without meaningful economic policies, that political enfranchisement has not led to any economic improvement. So I would say that's perhaps the extreme view. But having said that, South Africa has quite progressive policies around social protection relative to other countries. It's not enough, and I think the argument is always that it needs to be more reflective of the structures in the South African labor market. So there's a lot of informal workers that struggle to be covered, there's a lot of, as I was mentioning, there's 40% broad unemployed. There's a lot of talk now about a universal grant that may be able to support a large part of South African society that doesn't have access to formal jobs. I think that's always a contestation. I think where you do see the votes having influence often happens at the local elections. sometimes that's governed by kind of these patronage networks, but often when service delivery, municipal service delivery has not happened, you do see changes in municipal politicians, and I think it's yet to be evaluated how significant that impact is on social provisioning. But yeah, I think that's what we're continuously working towards, and yeah, we hope that our research can go towards supporting these more transformative policies.
All right, so let's give another round of applause to Arup. And then I would say we take 15 minutes for tea, so we try to gather here again at pretty much 11:45, so we can move on to our next lecture before we're having lunch. Thank you.
Sorry, I'd just like to make one more point, is that we are now building a resource that we hope can be used both for academics and non-academics, which is a website. And we really would love any contributions if you feel that you have to wealth inequality in the global south, that that it doesn't necessarily need to sit within these very sort of like academic paradigms. So yeah, please stay in touch, and if you ever have an idea, please get in touch with us, and we'll see if there's any ways that we can support you as well.